Thank you so much. That's one of the titles, at least. I was actually also really inspired by this conference, so I actually sat up until 4 a.m. this morning to change all my slides because I wanted to do something rather different from what I was planning to do. Largely because there have been so many great presentations that I was inspired by, and so many of the points that I wanted to make anyway, some of you made them so much better than I'm going to do. So that basically means that I think all of you are going to basically rip me a new one on at least one of these issues. So the thing I want to talk about is basically comparing the virtual with the real. And the background for this came, I did my PhD on Second Life a while ago, so long ago that it was during the hype era of Second Life, actually. And in my hometown at the moment, Enschede, we had a second Enschede in Second Life, a separate island. And I was intrigued by how pissed off people got about this. So actually in Enschede, they had started this anti-group that they called First Enschede. They started putting up posters around town calling us losers. There were talk of people getting in fights because they had been in Second Life. And also if you look at like discussion forums or discussion sections in newspaper articles, you'll see a lot of really angry people saying, "Get a life, you losers," and all the stereotypes around nerds. A lot of you have been told by your parents to get out and play instead of playing that stupid video game. So I got really intrigued about what is it that makes us think that virtual things are inferior to real things. So that's what I mean by VX versus RX. I'm basically comparing anything virtual, whether it's virtual education, virtual relationships, virtual love, virtual sex, virtual what have you. What are we actually presupposing when we're saying that one is less valuable than the other? So I'm going to try to focus mostly on friendship. That's going to be the main X that I'm going to be talking about. But I think you can plug in basically anything for X here. And the thing I want to show, and I want to be a bit careful about this, so if you haven't completely gotten over your hangover yet, try to just focus on this one message that I have to say in the beginning, which is that I'm not going to argue necessarily that virtual is less valuable than real. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to look at what are the presuppositions behind such a claim. Then I'm going to try to show how inherently controversial all of those presuppositions are. So I'm not going to argue for these premises in order to reach the conclusion. I'm going to go the other way. So in order to reach that conclusion, can we really presuppose these premises? And I want to show that each one is inherently controversial. And towards the end of this, I'm going to really tie this together with meaningfulness, because I was inspired by the topic of this conference. So just the last few weeks, I've been trying to sort of cash that out in one way or another. Okay, so with those disclaimers out of the way, let me have one last disclaimer, which is that I have a lot of stuff to get through. I will probably start skipping stuff at some point. I will probably talk too fast at some point. So if it becomes too chaotic, just tell me, "Johnny, please cool it, we're hungover. Be a bit more relaxed." But I still need to keep you awake, I think, so let's go. Okay, so just to make this relatively clear, and again, to sort of keep you sort of on track, I'm going to keep all those premises on the left side, and I'm going to go through them in turn, and I'm going to go through each of them in turn first, and at some point I'm going to go sort of drill down on number 3. What does it really mean that RX is better than VX? So first of all, if you're talking about something being better or worse than anything else, you're already presupposing some kind of theory about what it means to be good. And typically the kinds of things we're talking about here is something being good for somebody. So a virtual relationship, is that good for you? Virtual education, is that good for you? And if you want to make a claim like that, you're actually presupposing an entire theory of the good life. And I think most of you don't really have a theory of the good life. Most of humans don't really have a theory of the good life. We just walk around and stumble across happiness where you can find it without really having a theoretical approach to it. But ideally, that's what you really need if you start making claims about one thing being less good than another. You can do this in a philosophical way and really have a philosophical theory of the good life. Sort of the main types of theories of the good life you find from the philosophical point of view is either some kind of hedonist theory, where basically, hey, go for pleasure, try to avoid pain. Doesn't really say a whole lot. I think we all agree with hedonism, as long as we can define pleasure and pain the way we want to. Desire satisfaction theories is a different type of theory that also don't give you a whole lot of answers, a whole lot of normative guidance. The only kinds of theories that can actually make these kinds of claims is something known as objective list theories. And an objective list theory is a rather controversial thing. It's basically you're saying that certain things are necessary for a good life. So in other words, if you presuppose a view like this, which you kind of have to do to make a criticism like this, it basically means that you are justified in telling others that they are not happy. So if you tell me, oh, I'm really, really happy today, does it make sense for me to say, no, you're not? You might think you're happy, but I know you're not happy. Does that make sense or not? That question would have to make sense in order to get this thing started. So I'm actually not that interested in the philosophical theories. Actually, when I started my PhD on Second Life, I was basically, as often happens in the Netherlands, you're basically given a topic that you have to write about. And the topic that was given to me was, if I'm being a bit uncharitable, would Aristotle approve of World of Warcraft? Would Aristotle like Second Life? And I got in a big discussion with my supervisor and ended up saying, shit, I'm not going to do this. So I started looking into empirical research on happiness instead of philosophical theories and combined those. And I'm going to get back to that towards the end of this. So first of all, if you are trying to criticize all these virtual things, the first thing we have to presuppose is some theory of what is the good. The second thing we're presupposing, if we're saying that something virtual is less valuable than real, and that we see that as a problem, we are presupposing that the virtual is somehow easier to attain than the real. Like compare this, like if you figure out that Mars is actually made out of gold, that's not really going to affect the price of gold on Earth because it's so hard to get that gold. So the real problem here really starts going if you see this as a threat. So to make it a bit more concrete, having virtual friends, we shouldn't really care too much about that if it's really hard to find virtual friends. The problem, according to many of these critics, is that virtual friends are really easy to get. So you might be tempted to start replacing real friends with virtual friends. And I think this is the least controversial presupposition because I think it is easier to have virtual friends. But as I'll get back to, that's not necessarily a negative thing. And in some ways, this is where we sort of have our first branching point. So if you agree that X is good, let's say we agree that friendship is good, friendship is conducive to well-being, and second of all, you agree that virtual friends are easier to attain than real friends, well, isn't that damn good news? Friends are good, now it's easier to get them, yay, we can be much happier. Well, this is when we start diverging, this is where all these other premises really start becoming important. The first one is sort of the key premise behind this, that the real X is somehow better than the virtual X. I'm going to really drill down on this one at the very end of the lecture. I just wanted to point out already now that this is based on a very theoretical presupposition already. In order for something to be better or worse than something else, it has to be different. There has to be like an axiologically relevant difference. And I think with virtual entities, that's often not the case. So if you take, for instance, socially constructed entities, which most virtual entities are, and John Searle is very instructive for this, if you take a screwdriver is socially constructed. Like an alien wouldn't necessarily recognize a screwdriver if it came to Earth. So it is socially constructed, but you can't just use anything as a screwdriver either. It needs certain physical requirements in order to qualify as that. At the other end of the spectrum, you have things like money, where you don't really need any sort of physical properties for something to be money. We just need to basically all collectively recognize that this piece of paper counts as 5 euros in the context of Germany. So no physical properties are needed. So the really interesting category is the category, the sort of gray area in between there. Things like education, things like friendship, all of that, where physical properties seem to be important, perhaps even essential, but you can't really say that they are necessary for the thing to be the same, for the thing to be reproduced in a virtual world. So the things that I'm really going to focus on are precisely the thing in the gray area, the things where physical properties are not necessary, but you could argue that they are very important, for instance, when it comes to friendship. So for the real to be better than the virtual, certain physical characteristics must be important or essential, and the questions then become, is, for instance, physical contact essential or somehow important for friendship? If it isn't, then we shouldn't really be too worried about virtual friendships, which is ultimately an empirical question, and like I said, this is the thing I'm really going to dig down into towards the end of this. when it comes to, if you take a bit closer of a look at friendships and relationships, we might already start picking up some intrinsic and instrumental differences between them. For instance, it has been argued that one of the key things about real physical friendship is that you have something that's typically referred to as involuntary self-disclosure. This is basically when you reveal things about yourself that you don't really want to reveal. This is when you get too drunk one night and you crash your bike into a ditch, as we do in the Netherlands, and somebody has to help you home and hold your hair while you're puking. Like that is involuntary self-disclosure. And that's the kind of stuff that you don't really get in a virtual world, for good and bad. And it has been argued that that is when we really become intimate with each other. That's when we really get to know each other. And this becomes one of the biggest obstacles to genuine relationships, according to many of these critics. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. First of all, there's a lot of interesting research, for instance by Nick Yee and others, that basically suggests that we are more voluntarily disclosing ourselves in virtual worlds. So yes, you don't get the same sort of I reveal myself when I'm drunk kind of stuff, but we get more of that voluntarily sharing things about ourselves that we wouldn't share with people in the real world, that we actually have fewer masks in a virtual world than a real world. You can also talk about differences in terms of instrumental value instead, and this is actually something that I will return to a bit later, because I think there's something to this notion that virtual friends are less instrumentally valuable than real friends. And I think the key thing here is, and now basically try to imagine the most shitty friend you have, the kind of friend who just constantly drags you into horrible situations, the kind of friend who says, oh, come on, let's go drinking. No, shit, I got an exam tomorrow, I got the deadline tomorrow. No, come on, don't be a, insert your favorite derogatory term. Like that friend is really, really important because that friend is the kind of friend who's going to make you experience entirely new things. And that is something that's going to be very, very important towards the end of this. But let's leave that behind for a little while, because assume now that we go along with the critic. And please let me remind you, and also for the newcomers who came a bit late, what I'm doing now is that I'm trying to see, even if we agree with these premises as we move on, does the conclusion follow? And I don't think it is. So for instance, if we agree with these three first premises, we agree that friendship is good, we agree that virtual friends are easier to attain than real friends, and for the sake of the argument, let's also agree that real friends are better than virtual friends. Now, does the conclusion follow that you should not follow virtual friends, that you should not put your eggs in that basket, so to speak? I don't think so. And again, a theory of the good life comes into this, or basically rather a decision strategy of some sort. There's a very fundamental distinction in decision strategy between maxi-min and maxi-max. Maxi-min, then you kind of sort of the boring kind of guy or girl. If you follow a maxi-min strategy in life, you basically try to avoid things going really, really bad. You're not going to get the optimal outcome, but you're not going to have the worst outcome either. This is a bit like if you're gambling, for instance, and you gamble €1, maybe you'll win €2 if you win, and you'll lose €1 if you lose. That's the maxi-min approach. That's the sort of, I'm tempted to say, Norwegian social democrat approach. You try to avoid the worst losses, but you're not going to get the biggest gains either. The opposite approach is the maxi-max approach, where you basically, I'm going to bet my year's salary that Hertha Berlin is going to win the series this year. And if that doesn't happen, you're going to lose all your money. If it does happen, you're going to win a lot of money. And this is basically a choice you do in life. This is a very sort of deep existentialist theory of the good life kind of choice. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. But the key thing here is that if you agree with all these premises, that friendship is good, easier to attain in virtual worlds, and the real ones are better, still you can make the argument that, I'm still going to go for virtual friends actually, because I don't really have a good chance of having real friends. Real friends suck. I'm really bad at getting real friends, and so on and so on. So actually, I'm going to put my eggs in that basket. I'm going to go for virtual friends, even if they are inferior. And I still think that's a completely rational decision, and it's the premise that we can't just take for granted, which it would have to do in order to reach that conclusion. But now comes sort of the main thing here, and this is the thing that I think maybe many of you regard as one of the most stupid premises behind these kinds of claims, which is that the virtual somehow replaces the real. So what is the problem with having virtual friends if you have virtual friends in addition to your real friends? So in order to criticize virtual friends, or virtual education, or virtual whatever, in order to criticize that, you're basically saying that this thing that is so good in real life, when you're replacing that with something inferior in the virtual world, that's why it's problematic. Now, this is where I think there's a lot of really disingenuous scholars out there, because they often sort of pick this premise based on a conclusion they want to reach. So I hope I can sort of explain this. So the key thing is that whenever something is bad in the real world, then the criticism is typically that, this is bad in the real world, and then if you do that in a virtual world, it encourages you to do that bad thing in the real world as well. So this is, I've seen people use this premise in the same paper as they use the opposite one. So in this premise, you're saying that the virtual thing encourages something that's bad in the real world. So for instance, virtual violence, that's going to make it more likely that you do real violence. Ergo, virtual games and virtual worlds are bad. But I've seen in the same paper, the same author turning this premise on its head when they're criticizing virtual friends. Because now they're not talking about something being bad in the real world and the virtual encouraging that. Now they're typically talking about something being good in the real world, and then, oh no, then the virtual suddenly replaces the thing that is good in the real world. So now suddenly having a virtual friend is something that replaces real friends, ergo it's bad. But for both of these, it's certainly not sort of a priori impossible that exactly the opposite happens. That engaging in virtual violence might actually replace real violence through catharsis and that kind of stuff. And the same thing with friendships as well. Instead of virtual friends replacing real friends, it is actually quite as likely that virtual friendships encourage real friendships. And there are tons of examples of this as well, that people can overcome different kinds of social problems in virtual worlds and then put those skills into practice in the real world and actually have more friends because of it. So again, I'm not saying really what the answer is here. I'm just saying that this premise is inherently controversial and is often just taken for granted, or even worse, is cherry-picked very often in order to reach the conclusion they want to reach. There's in particular one paper where I saw one guy criticize Tamagotchis, who are actually coming back. They're actually coming back into fashion now. And I hope you remember what Tamagotchis were. So the same author criticized Tamagotchis for producing in teenagers this tendency to neglect the real animals. So the virtual animal starts replacing the real animal. But in that same paper, that same author argued that, also doing violence in virtual worlds towards animals, that encourages violence against animals in the real world. So again, cherry-picking that premise based on the conclusion they want to reach. So again, something we really need to be careful about. There are also a lot of other stuff going on behind behind the scenes here. For if you're talking about something replacing the real, and especially when you're talking about emotions and states of mind, what is typically presupposed is this sort of bottom model of how virtual events are going to affect our states of mind. A very influential social intuitionist model of moral judgment by Haidt. And according to this kind of model, if you have some kind of eliciting situations, for instance, sort of killing that prostitute in GTA, you get an intuition automatically, then that intuition feeds into the judgment, and that becomes now your moral reasoning. And then you start influencing others, so that's the sort of social part of this. And that is the model that is presupposed again, and it's certainly not an uncontroversial model either. This is the sort of more classical Kohlberg model, where this eliciting situation starts an effect and then starts the reasoning process. And I think there are good reasons to believe that games cause reasoning as much as they cause emotional change. And I'm trying to be a bit careful there, but I think this is especially the case for good games that can really cause you to reflect on the choices you make. A very sort of almost trite, the classical example of this is, of course, good old Duck. So when you're in that situation in Walking Dead where you have to choose who is going to kill Duck, is it going to be the father, or are you going to do it yourself? It's a sort of a very value-laden choice you have to make. As you can see, roughly 80% chose the father. And the key thing, again, is that this sort of reflects the moral choice. And I think Miguel Sicard is absolutely right about this, is that you have something happening at sort of the game mechanics level, but you have something different happening at the semantic level. And that is when you really start reflecting on those choices. And I think that really supports that these virtual events do not just change our moral sentiments, they also change our rational ways of thinking about things. You can say the same thing about this sort of virtual rape thing that happened a while back ago as well. I can get back to that in the discussion if there's time. I'm just going to mention this very quickly just to really bring out the point that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So just again, if you go along with the supposed critic, let us all agree, for the sake of the argument, that X is good, friendship is good, virtual friends are easier to attain than real friends. Let's also agree that real friends are better than virtual friends. Let also, for the heck of it, agree that, yes, we ought to follow this sort of maxi-min strategy. And let's also really actually agree that the virtual tends to replace the real. Then surely the conclusion must follow that nobody should ever seek virtual friends instead of real friends. I don't even think that's the case either, because then you're presupposing that there's some kind of opportunity cost involved when you're choosing virtual friends. And for a lot of people, that opportunity cost isn't even there. I was actually quite pissed when I did my PhD because we wanted to implement Second Life in a rehabilitation center for elderly. And there were so many of those who were entirely social isolated, had no family left, hardly any social interaction at all. And we wanted to bring in Second Life to have them have some kind of social interaction at least. The management said, nope, you're not allowed to do that. That's an inferior form of communication. We need the human touch. Sure, we need the human touch, but we don't have the human touch. And that's the kind of thinking that I'm really critical of. You see the same thing with care robots as well. That, oh, we can't have care robots, we really need real nurses. Sure, in an ideal world, but if you don't have that option, it's a heck of a lot better to have something slightly inferior than to have nothing at all. So even if you agree with all of these premises, I still think the ultimate conclusion doesn't actually follow. Now, let's make this even worse. So I want to sort of really start drilling down on this number 3. What does it really mean that the real X is better than the virtual X? And at this point is where I want to draw more on empirical research. And I'm particularly interested in the question of what can empirical research tell us about which activities and experiences that are most conducive to well-being. And I'm especially going to draw on positive psychology and related fields here. And to what extent, in particular, can those activities and experiences be reproduced in games? And this is actually sort of my main research project, up until recently at least, is to sort of look at positive psychology, look at research on happiness, try to find out what kinds of activities tend to make people happier, and then see, can we reproduce this in a responsible way by using technology, by using games? And I'm going to focus on games now. There are two sides to this. And it's sort of an interesting distinction and an interesting sort of divergence in this research between what is known as well-being and what is known as meaningfulness. These are sort of the two sort of main determinants of sort of overall happiness. And they usually support each other, but sometimes they come apart, as I will explain shortly. So on the one hand, you have the well-being part of this, and these are the kinds of things that tend to generate this really somewhat lasting, but still also somewhat temporary happiness. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I'm a hedonist at heart, so these pleasures are certainly not inferior, I think. It's just that they're a bit less sort of substantive sometimes, and strangely enough, they're often overridden by this meaningful thing, as I'll get back to shortly. And I want to get to the meaningfulness, since that's the topic of this conference. I'm not going to say too much about this, but some of the things that sort of obviously can be reproduced in games, things that have been shown again and again and again in empirical research to drastically determine happiness, are things like flow, of course. Flow is sort of the most famous thing to come out of this research, which has been used quite a lot. But you also have a lot of other interesting stuff. For instance, being social and collaborating and sharing, collaborating in World of Warcraft, those kinds of things, but also sharing the experiences that happen to you. One of the pillars of this positive psychology, one of the sort of most recurring findings, is that things that happen to you doesn't really affect your happiness that much. Winning the lottery, losing your legs, things like that has a very limited effect on your happiness. The kind of things that really can affect your happiness are the things that you do, sort of intentional activities that you choose to do. So as I said, when something sort of bad or good happens to you, it doesn't really affect your happiness that much. But when you start sharing that with others and getting sort of responses from others, that's when it really starts having a much larger effect. And that determines the direction in which things go. So if you win the lottery and everybody thinks you're an asshole for winning the lottery, pardon my French, that lottery thing is not really going to make you as happy. But if you come across a lot of money because you've done a damn good job and somebody sort of pats you on the back and say, yeah, you deserve that million, you really deserve that, then the exact same amount of money is going to make you much more happy than in the sort of lottery case. So sharing has become one of the key things that sort of determines this effect. And it's kind of an intriguing thing as well, because there's something sort of weirdly generational going on here. Because for old farts like me, having a genuine response when I share something with somebody else typically involves like a pat on the back or a hug or at least a smile and a look into the eye. But that's because I grew up 100 years ago. For the generation coming up now, Facebook likes and retweets and that kind of stuff is actually starting to replace some of that. So I don't really see a Facebook like as a genuine response of emotion. Younger generations really tend to do so. There is some really sad research about sort of 14-year-old girls updating their profile pictures, not getting a certain predictable amount of likes within a certain amount of time, really spirals them into a deep depression. Well, it's sort of 14-year-old girl depression, so it's not that bad. But still, it really affects their happiness quite drastically in a way that it really doesn't for those of us who are used to more physical expressions. You also have a lot of other stuff going on here. Like I said, I'm not going to go very deeply into this, but social comparison in general is something that has been found to really affect happiness. So the amount of money you have doesn't really affect your happiness, absolutely. But if you have more money than your neighbor, if you're sort of not only keeping up, but going beyond the Joneses, that is the kind of stuff that really affects your happiness much more. And I think this is something we see reflected more and more in games as well now. I think except for perhaps a few elite gamers out there, you can't really compete on the top of the leaderboard. It's really impossible to do so. But you can compete against your Facebook friends. And I think this is why we see more and more of these localized leaderboards, Facebook leaderboards, leaderboards consisting of your Xbox Live friends and so on, because that taps into that benign envy and that notion of social comparison, where a lot of happiness, sort of immediate happiness, comes from as well. Suspension of disbelief is also found to be really conducive to happiness. Basically, the more realistic you are, the less happy you are. So being a bit delusional about life is really conducive to well-being, and there is evidence supporting also the fact that games actually make us better able to suspend our disbelief and make us better able to basically not be as realistic and sort of pessimistic about the world. I also wanted to really illustrate that some of this is really obvious, but some of this is a bit more sort of counterintuitive as well. For instance, when it comes to perceptual pleasure, this is the kind of stuff that gives you a lot of perceptual pleasure. Again, I'm revealing how old of a fart I am, because some of you have maybe not even seen this. This was like all the rage back in the 90s. It's called a random dot stereogram. And it's the kind of stuff that you sort of squint your eyes and you try to sort of look through the projector. At some point, your brain is going to sort of snap into place with this pattern and reconstruct a shark in 3 dimensions. And it takes a bit of practice if you haven't done it before, and it's really hard to do on a projector as well. But this is very symptomatic of the kinds of perceptual pleasure that gives you that sort of happiness boost. It's when you are confronted with a chaos of information, but through learning and through training, you can find patterns in that chaos. And that's the kind of stuff where your brain goes, yay, I can categorize, I can find patterns, and it really spews out all those wonderful chemicals. So this is, of course, an obscure example of this. A more common example of this is that, as opposed to yesterday, for most of us just drinking wine to get sort of tipsy and drunk, if you drink wine for the experience of picking out the different nuances, there's a bit of French dirt and a bit of pencil and so on. Like if you can categorize sort of the chaotic sense impressions like that, that again is the sort of stuff that gives you that sort of lasting well-being. Or if you're like a music theory buff and you can listen to a really complex piece of music and pick out the different layers and how the sort of different instruments come into it and so on, your brain is on holiday. It loves doing that stuff. And again, I think this is something a lesson that is very important for a lot of sort of user interfaces, for a lot of games as well. So not go the Microsoft route and try to make things as simple as possible, but rather go the more chaotic route. I might get back to that a little bit later, but I need to speed up a little bit. So that was just to show that not all of this research is entirely evident. A lot of it is evident and very much in line with intuition, but there is also some weird stuff and some really inspiring stuff coming out of this. And I'm working with some students on trying to translate this into actual user interfaces right now. But what about sense of meaningfulness, which is this weird thing? Because when these researchers trying to research happiness, typically they use a lot of different ways of operationalizing it. They use a lot of different kinds of tests. So some tests, you basically test the real time. What are you doing right now, and how happy does it make you right now? But they also have these more sort of reflective tests and surveys, where you basically reflect on your life as a whole, and then sort of reflect on your goals and how close you are to your ideals and that kind of stuff. And very often, in most cases, those things entirely support each other. So the stuff that sort of makes you happy in the moment tends to also give you that sense of purpose and sense of meaningfulness. There are a few very interesting parts or areas where they completely come apart. And as I'm sure many of you will support, parenting is one of the clearest examples. Ask parents in a moment, and they are the most miserable people in the world. Ask people about how happy they are with their life as a whole. They are some of the happiest people in the world. So those kinds of things is where it entirely comes apart. So that's what I'm intrigued by. So I wanted to see at that other side of this thing, how that applies to games. What kinds of things determine meaningfulness in games? And again, this is where sort of the hardcore philosophers in the room might start hating me, because I'm going to get back to some philosophically inspired notions of meaningfulness, but first I'm going to look a bit at this sort of empirical notion of meaningfulness. What is it that sort of makes people report that they feel a sense of purpose, a sense of meaningfulness? And the thing that really stands out with the people who sort of have a sense of having a meaningful life is that they qualify, or they satisfy rather, two conditions. So the first condition is that they have identified something they feel they're really damn good at. They have identified some kind of individual strength. This already has implications. I'm not going to get too much into it, but already it goes against the sort of societal pressure that you need to get better at the things you're bad at. Nope. If you want to be happy, if you want to have a sense of purpose, it's much better to just focus on the things you're already good at and get even better at it. So I think there's a lot of sort of wrong thinking in society when it comes to that. But those sort of really, the people who really sort of consistently report that they feel like they have a sense of purpose, not only have they sort of identified their individual strengths, and by the way, when I say identify, I mean that in a very strong sense. So not just that you play the guitar, but that you are a guitar player. Not just that you play games, but that you are a gamer. It's somehow something you see as part of your identity. So if you have that, and in addition to that, you have a sense that you use that particular strength for a purpose you perceive to be meaningful, those tend to be the people who really sort of rank at the top of these kinds of empirical research. And again, there's no sort of objective standard of meaningfulness here. It's all about, do you perceive this to be meaningful or not? So it's entirely subjective in some sense, but typically, partly because of social norms and so on, it entails this sort of sense that you're contributing to some purpose you regard as greater than yourself. It often has to do with sort of religious faith, but certainly not necessarily. It often can also come from some sense of community and some sense of immortality. Things like having children or sort of going down in history in one way or another. And I actually think this is also shown to be really a motivational thing, which I'll get back to. And I think this actually explains a lot of the weird things going on online, also with Creative Commons and open source and so on. Like if you look at the people who just pour hours into sort of weird projects like adding subtitles to anime movies and spend so much of their spare time doing this for no money, no fame even in many cases, but still they spend so much time doing this. And I think the motivation for that comes from this sense of contributing to something bigger than yourself. Same thing if you're editing Wikipedia and you sort of get that warm, mushy feeling inside afterwards, is because you have that sense of contributing to something that might outlive you even. So this is one of the sort of most common reports of truly sort of meaningful activities. And certainly online permanence is one of the key things here as well, which I will get back to soon. I just wanted to say a few things about that first thing. So one of the questions here, which is going to be relevant for virtual worlds, is how on earth do you identify your strength? How do you figure out what it is that you're really uniquely good at? Now, there are different ways of doing that. There are actually different kinds of psychological tests that you can do. This is probably way too much information, but this is me. And this is a test where you ask all kinds of weird questions, and you sort of get this list of your top strengths and your sort of weakest strengths. And to those of you who know me a little bit, you might not be too surprised that I have almost no spirituality or hope. That's also sort of my really weak points. But the things that are really important to me, and I'm not saying these are things I'm good at, but the things that are important to me in life are things like love of learning, humor, judgment, love, and creativity. So you can do these kinds of things to sort of get some insight into what are your unique strengths, but I don't think really that is the main way of doing it. I think it's actually much simpler than that. You just have to do a lot of, and again, pardon my technical French, you have to do a lot of different shit in order to find out what you're really good at. One of my favorite things to do now, and perhaps as a philosopher, the only meaningful thing that I do is to teach. If you had asked me to stand in front of 5 people and teach 5 years, 10, 12, oh God, I'm getting old, 15 years ago, I would have, again, technical, shit my pants. Like, I was really nervous for standing in front of a crowd before. I couldn't even imagine teaching being something that I felt that I wanted to do, something that I felt would be meaningful. It was just purely because of stumbling across it that I discovered this as one of the main favorite activities I have. So again, just trying out a lot of different stuff seems to be the way to really sort of stumble across these kinds of things. And if you would rather have this from a philosopher than from empirical research, good old Nietzsche comes to the rescue. Danger alone acquaints us with our own resources, our virtue, our armor and weapons, our spirit. And I'm not going to completely destroy your beautiful language by repeating that. But live dangerously, as Nietzsche put it. That's the only way in which you can really identify those unique strengths. Paradoxically, virtual worlds do not allow for the same range. And I think this is, as techno-optimist as I am, I think this is one of the most negative things about virtual worlds and virtual reality and games still, is that it's a very limited range of strengths you can discover through gaming. Certainly gaming itself is a strength that you can discover, and there's nothing wrong with that, as I'll return to. But beyond that, it's very hard to really get a lot of those different kinds of experiences that will eventually sort of propel you into some kind of path that you can sort of pursue further. So I think paradoxically all the virtual worlds and games are supposed to be about only the imagination setting limits. I still think the fact that you are sort of reduced to a peripheral interacting with some kind of console still means that you have fewer options available. So I think the notion of identifying what you're really good at, I think that's where actually the RX has some advantage over the VX. But, as I said, gaming itself isn't that a strength, and I really honestly think it is. And certainly when you're getting really, really good at the game, that is something that, of course, you get a lot of these effects from flow and all that good stuff, but it also is something that you can really identify. Like, if you really identify it as, I am a gamer, or I am a warlord, or anything like that, you can certainly get some of that really beneficial effect. But then the question becomes, can you satisfy that second condition? Because recall, as I said, sort of the people who tend to sort of most consistently report themselves as having sort of a meaningful life, have identified a strength and feel that they use that strength for something they see as meaningful. Well, can you do that with games? I think this is a problem, and this is where this is not the entirely right audience, because I think a lot of you feel gaming to be meaningful in different kinds of ways, and you're absolutely right in thinking that. But the thing that I'm most interested in is actually not you guys. I'm interested in all of humanity. So how can we basically make more people than in this room have a sense that their gaming strengths are meaningful? How can we sort of embed meaningfulness in games? And I think this is partly a social problem. Like I said, your sense of meaningfulness is entirely subjective, but it doesn't mean that it's entirely random. It means that it's basically determined by societal norms, societal expectations, parental expectations, spousal expectations, and so on. So when everybody keeps telling you that this is a meaningless activity, it's getting hard to really sort of get into that state of mind where you are completely confident that what you're doing is meaningful. I think with some societal change we can get a better grip of this, but it is very hard, and you see it so well in society as well. You hear about video game addicts all the time. You never really hear about chess addicts. You never really hear about sports addicts, because society has already determined that those are meaningful activities, and games are not. And hopefully we're seeing a change, but I still think that's very slow. But beyond sort of societal change, can we sort of implement things in the games themselves to make the games more meaningful? And this is where I just want to introduce one piece of a distinction here. I generally try to avoid the whole sort of magic circle and Casanovas membranes and all that stuff. So when I think about virtual actions, I see every virtual action as a vector of some sort, which involves intra-virtual consequences and extra-virtual consequences. So anything you could do in a game, it has certain consequences within the game, and it has certain consequences outside the game. And I think every virtual action, I can't think of any exceptions really. I think every virtual action has both of those two components in varying degrees. So instead of talking about magic circles and so on, I want to try to sort of analyze this and put them apart a bit and talk about, can we put extra virtual effects into a game that make them more meaningful, and can we put intra-virtual effects into a game and make them meaningful? So let me look at the extra virtual one first, which I think in some ways is the easiest one. So these are consequences external to the game, external to the virtual world, so basically external to the computer. So one of the clear things here is acts of kindness. And again, there's so much empirical research sort of very strongly saying that being an ethical person, being an altruistic person is much better for happiness than being a selfish bastard. Altruistic people are actually generally much happier than selfish people. This is the kind of stuff that Plato and Aristotle were ranting about without really having much support, but now there is a lot of empirical support for that. I've actually tried to take this and change it into the way I sort of interact with people in games. I just wanted to show you a quick example. This is from me playing Pro Evolution Soccer, and I miraculously won against one of the best players in the game, who is also reputed as one of the worst assholes in the game. So of course he accused me of lagging, which is a technique that a lot of people use in the game. He told me to, in really bad English, to do all kinds of interesting things to myself. So I responded to him actually in a very dry academic manner. I wrote him a long message back to him explaining the nature of lagging, the nature of jumping to conclusions, and I was really sort of formal and boring about it. So I expected a lot of more flack coming back from him. 10 minutes later, I got, okay, sorry. And this guy actually turned out to become one of my best friends in the game. And eventually I brought other people playing who had basically blocked him before. So I started bringing him into new teams and so on. And he actually became a much more popular player after, this sounds like I'm really bragging about myself. But in general, by being kind to people, you could actually say that I was being completely selfish, because it really felt me feel much better, made me feel much better as well. So these acts of kindness are certainly things you can do in games to have those extra virtual consequences. I'll need to skip up a little bit. So you can add meaningfulness to games. Another very simple way of adding sort of extra virtual meaning to games is to have some kind of really sort of indubitably meaningful effect out there in the real world. And you start seeing some of these games coming out. For instance, Fold It, which is a game where you basically sort of figure out molecular structures and the structures of enzymes. And these researchers have been battling this really difficult enzyme for a decade. And this enzyme was really important to understand in order to try to arrive at a cure for AIDS. And they gave it to the gamers in Fold It, and the gamers solved it in I think, 10 days, with something the researchers had spent a decade trying to figure out. And it really qualifies this thing I talked about, people who are not only good at the game, but also really good at sort of chemistry and biology. So they really use their strength in the game for a purpose, which is to cure AIDS. What can possibly be more meaningful than that? You have other games as well, where you basically traverse sort of DNA databases and help researchers find anomalies in DNA and so on. So you can sort of help cure cancer while you're playing the game. So this is the sort of extra virtual meaningfulness. But I'm also interested in the other side of this. I think this is quite easy to do. What might be more difficult to do is getting intra-virtual meaningfulness, so consequences internal to the game. As I said, well-being and meaningfulness are usually sort of congruent and support each other, but they tend to come apart whenever you start dealing with temporality and our notion of finitude and mortality and those kinds of things. That's when typically happy people tend to be have a less sense of meaning, and people with sort of a sense of meaning tend to be less happy. So again, parenting is one of the clear examples of this kind of stuff. So well-being is typically sort of centered on the present, centered on the here and now, whereas meaningfulness tends to sort of go beyond the here and now, be much more about sort of things you've done in the past, making plans for the future, and that kind of stuff. And that is, of course, why they can come apart. So this perceived meaningfulness, it seems to really require sort of the perception, at least, that we make some kind of lasting change to a lasting world. And especially, and I don't really have time to go into it, but especially sort of in the face of finitude and your own mortality and so on, and you can sort of plug in Heidegger here if you want. So in other words, this correct impression that virtual worlds are impermanent and will not outlive us remains, I believe, one of the biggest obstacles to this sort of truly intra-virtual meaningfulness in virtual worlds. And this is something I was really inspired by a lot of the talks that have been going on here, because I find it sort of inspiring how much games try to give you this sense of meaningfulness, as many of you have pointed out. So for instance, Fraser was talking about ruins in games and how important they are to sort of give you that sort of sense of time and temporality, and the sense that this place has a history. I also found Yannick's talk about ghosts in games very inspiring. And again, ghosts sort of giving you this impression that there's temporality going on here. There's a history behind this. But in some sense, I don't mean this negatively, but in some sense, this is artificial temporality. Like, these aren't real ghosts, of course. They aren't real ruins. So that was actually interesting when somebody brought up the Second Life ruins, which are sort of somehow more real ruins and sort of more indicate temporality in that sense. But I think that to get this really widespread sense, we need to have a more deeper sense of permanence. And the other thing that came up, which I really find to be such a touching story, which I think all of you have heard about, is, of course, this classic story about this boy. And just for those of you who didn't get it, very quickly, this boy who used to play games with his father and had this sort of really meaningful activity with his father. And then, as some of these games do, and this rally game in particular, and also other games, they leave sort of this shadow car, this ghost car that you can race against later. And I found it, again, so instructive that not only is it now become one of the most meaningful things he can do in a game, is precisely to play against the shadow of his father, against the ghost of his father, but also precisely this notion that he can't win against his father, because if he does, the permanence is lost, the meaningfulness is lost. And perhaps even worse, when he inevitably gets sort of the red ring of death, then it's also possibly quite lost. So again, this sort of fragility is what sort of is the biggest threat to that sense of meaningfulness. And this is where things get really weird, and I don't have time to really go into this. We can bring it up again in the discussion, because what we are looking at, if we start talking about these really permanent worlds, are exactly the kinds of worlds that Berkeley and Malebranche and some of these really obscure philosophers were talking about back in the day. Some of you might recognize Berkeley from this sort of esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. This is sort of his superhero doll, which has the fantastic ability of just closing its eyes, because then the monsters disappear. But those of you who know your Berkeley, that's not true, of course, because everything is idealistic in Berkeley. Everything exists in his mind, so when he closes his eyes, things disappear, apparently. But no, they don't, because there's a God, according to Berkeley. So when he closes his eyes, the monsters don't disappear. They exist in the mind of God. And of course, this is just absolute rubbish about the real world. I hope I don't offend anyone by saying that. But it makes absolute 100% perfect sense when you talk about virtual worlds. Because when you sort of close your eyes to the virtual world, when you log out of the virtual world, there is a God that keeps looking at the monsters, that keep looking at the virtual entities. And that is, of course, the computer simulation lying underneath. And it's quite fascinating, just if you read Berkeley, whenever you see creator or anything like that, just replace that with computer, and you have like some of the most precise definitions of virtual reality you can find. And this is, I'm going to be a bit quick about this. I actually think Malebranche is even more close to this. Just look at this phrase. where Malebranche is trying to talk about causality and how causality happens and so on. And again, if you do some sort of weird karaoke thing here, we can just replace the creator here with computer. So virtual entities are essentially dependent on the computer, so dependent that they cannot subsist without the computer's influence. There's a contradiction in saying that you can move your virtual chair. No power can transport it where the computer simulation does not transport it, nor fix or keep it where the computer simulation does not fix or keep it. So in other words, these sort of Berkeley and Malebranchian gods are precisely the sort of computer simulators lying behind that sort of keeps up the permanence. Without those gods, the world cannot be permanent. That's the only way in which the world can be permanent. And I think that is the sort of reality we're heading towards with virtual worlds if we want to have permanence in them. And the question then becomes a bit sort of rhetorical, who will be these new gods? And this raises this whole set of new philosophical and ethical questions by sort of the need for a strong permanence and this intravirtual meaningfulness. And in particular, there are companies that try to do things like that. This is something called the Attorney Me, really not very intuitive name. Attorney Me, they try to sort of, for money, they're going to make sure that your avatar is going to live forever, that your memories are going to live forever, and so on. But the problem with really trusting that permanence is basically just looking at history, because there was another company that tried to do exactly the same thing 5 years ago. And if you go to their website now, this is what you're going to see. They basically went bankrupt, and all the avatars and all that sort of permanence just got lost with the bankruptcy. So the god basically went bankrupt and didn't care about the world anymore. That's the kind of reality we're facing here. So in other words, I think if the permanence of a virtual world cannot be guaranteed to the same extent as the permanence of the real world, I'm afraid that that is going to be one of the biggest obstacles to sort of the VX being as meaningful as the RX. But again, that's just like the ultimate goal. Like, still, it doesn't mean that games are really inferior. It just means like in this area, games might still have a bit of a problem. So on that note, I'm going to let it go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this real talk.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. The hypothetical person making this argument is defining good in terms of individual happiness, it seems. Do you think that if another person were to make a similar argument, but think about good in terms of some political project or idea of social good, and I'm thinking particularly from a Chinese context, where this kind of argument is made in relation to social harmony and the damage that virtuality might do to that. Can a similar argument be made?
Right. Yes, that's a very, very good point. I should have clarified that from the beginning. So when I've been talking about well-being and meaningfulness, I've been entirely talking about the individual. And it's absolutely correct that is completely different from this political conception of the good life. For instance, typically, these positive psychology research, they have this sort of formula where you basically calculate, you multiply your level of happiness with your number of life years. And that is basically a definition of the good life. And that makes perfect sense from a political point of view, that really old people having really happy lives seems to be a really happy society. But it makes no sense to me from an individual point of view. Like, at least from my point of view, 10 years of bliss is much better than 80 years of sort of mediocrity. So again, absolutely, yeah, that would be a completely different talk if I were to talk about that. So yes, very important clarification. Thanks.
Thank you, John, for your lecture. And I have to say, you're using a lot of very big words, and that's where my particular problem lies. Maybe you decided not to refer to the understanding of them in your research for time reasons. But so I'll make a comment and then I ask specific questions. And the three particularly important words that reappeared throughout your presentation were the beginning, virtuality, where you did not tell us how you place yourself in the virtuality versus reality discourse. It was a very jargon-like understanding of what is virtual and what is real. No mention of the concept of actual. It was a very Kantian mind-body dualism. Then you use the word happiness, and you also use the word well-being. You give us the five, the flow, the being social thing. But again, all my questions are about your understanding of those concepts that are like foundations for your research. What do you mean when you talk about happiness? And the third very important word that you ended up with is meaning, and that is even worse in sense of this is getting even more complex, because and it maybe would be really, really good to go back to the etymology of the word itself. The word meaning in English is a really fairly new word. You would probably go back to the German Sinn, and that would bring you on the path of the English sense, perception, and it actually means the way and the journey. And the only hint you're giving me is meaning as something, again, bigger than ourselves. And so my question would be actually, how do you understand virtuality, happiness, and meaning? Or how do you place yourself in this discourse? And one little comment I would like to make about meaning, and you mentioned Folded. Folded is a citizen science game, and this is part of my research. And you do not need any knowledge of chemistry whatsoever. The trick is the meaningfulness in Folded, and this is how it gets really contextual, is going back into a very Protestant logic. A game that has an external purpose. A game that is not, in a Hosingian understanding, pure play. So that meaningfulness for people who play Folded is this very, actually productive, being productive to the society. They're very capitalistic as well, understanding of what meaningfulness is. So that is just one example in one context. So
right.
Thanks again.
I hope you have a couple hours. No, exactly. Like, this is where I depart a bit from the sort of more theoretical understanding of thing, and this is where I buy into the psychologist's inferiority complex, to put it that way. I generally think like psychology is a very problematic field in the sense that, oh, we want to be a science as well, but then of course we can't measure things with numbers. So the big thing in psychology is of course to operationalize things so that you have numbers on things. Things like IQ, for instance, you can't measure intelligence, but you can operationalize it. So instead of going into those philosophical discussions of what meaningfulness is and what happiness is objectively, first of all, I don't honestly think those are objective terms. I'm much more interested in how people perceive those kinds of things. So the notion of happiness I'm talking about is the operationalized concept. Like, what tends to make people report that they feel happy, that they have a sense of well-being. And the same thing with meaningfulness as well. What is it that tends to make a lot of people report that they feel they have a sense of purpose? And that's why I really like psychology rather than philosophy when it comes to that, because you can make it so much more concrete. Of course, there's a lot of controversy to that, a lot of methodological problems and so on, which I do talk about in the other talks. That sounds like a cop-out, but I really do. But I just couldn't really go into that here. But in general, my answer is that I think an operationalized concept of meaningfulness and well-being is much more useful. I think it's certainly much more useful to engineers when engineers are designing games and so on. And
I have no time for the discussion. I would love to take you to a coffee break or whatever, and I would challenge you actually. You're very number-oriented and practical. I mean, this is very important, but the foundation of the understanding is, I think, equally, if not more.
okay, let's fight it out afterwards. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
I enjoyed the talk very much. Have a couple of points. Let me just ask one of them. I think this project that you're describing is very likely to be successful, actually. I think you can use this design that you've outlined here to increase happiness, as you've defined it. At one point in your talk, you mentioned suspension of disbelief. I've talked about this in the past, and it's a little more of a concern to me, and I've taken it out of its literary context and talked about it more in terms of active reinforcement of false belief.
Right.
So what I think you're perhaps doing or proposing to do is something similar to creating a happy pill for people. You certainly can create a context based on your research that I think will produce the effects you want to achieve, making people happy, but I'm a concern that this is sort of an illusionary form of happiness. I'm not sure if this consequence, although achievable, is ethical or what, could you comment on that?
Yeah, and again, I wish I could have a couple of hours for this. So the other part of this that I try to emphasize in other contexts is sort of the philosophical foundation of all of this. So there is a theory of the good life lying under all of it, and it's a form of hedonism. And for those of you who know Fred Feldman, it's inspired by Fred Feldman's version of hedonism. And his version of hedonism is, first of all, he makes one very important move. He moves from experiential hedonism to attitudinal hedonism. So it's not about being pleased by, but it's about taking pleasure in, which is a much more reflexive component, which allows for different types of pleasures to qualify and different types of pleasure not to qualify. But what I do okay, this is too long a story, I'm going to try to make it short. So what Feldman does, he adds something he calls adjustments to this. So he ends up with a theory that he calls truth-adjusted intrinsic attitudinal hedonism. So the things you take pleasure in that are also true are the kinds of things that give you happiness. I think Feldman is completely wrong about that. And in particular, again, looking to the empirical research, I'm not a religious person myself, but religion is something that really seems to cause this deep, lasting happiness for a lot of people. If Feldman is right, and in general, if this notion that something has to be true in order to really induce happiness to be right, it means that everybody who's religious, perhaps except one denomination, are ipso facto unhappy because their God doesn't exist. So grounding happiness in truth, I think, is entirely wrong. So what I try to ground it or adjust it with instead is confidence. And again, that can be operationalized as sort of a lack of cognitive dissonance. So I think you can take, in principle, you can take pleasure in absolutely everything, but there are limits to what you can confidently take pleasure in. So you can't confidently take pleasure in just shooting up heroin for a week, because there's part of you going to think that, this is not a very sustainable lifestyle. You can't confidently take pleasure in being a pedophile, because there's a part of you that's going to say that this is not ethically acceptable. So that puts limits to what kinds of things you can do. So again, sort of happy pills and that kind of stuff, you can't, in my view, and from the point of view of that theory, you can't confidently take pleasure in that as a part of your happiness. So that's sort of a bumper sticker version of a much bigger thing. But yes, it's a very, very important concern, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny, again for your keynote.